Hi, everyone. I'm Alison.
And I'm Mark. And welcome to ReNouned podcast. This is our very first episode. So what we're going to do is we are going to use a random word generator, literally something I found on the web. And we're going to have that return for us a noun. So each week we will start the show with the noun that we were given the week before. But of course, as today is our very first episode, you will see Alison and I do it live right now, and then we'll just magically cut. And the rest of the episode, a week will have passed. So, all right, I guess with, further ado here, we'll see what the fates have in mind for our very first research week. So let me go over here.
I'm very excited and very nervous at the same time.
What are we going to get? So let's do a 3, 2, 1. Orbit.
Okay.
ORBIT. Orbit.
I like that, Mark. It sounds like we're in an elementary school spelling bee.
Oh, can you use it in a sentence?
Well, probably many sentences, which will be the continuation of this episode. So as Mark laid out for the format, this is, our initial rating. I hear this word rating 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest. How am I feeling about this word? Am I excited to dig into this? Am I kind of like, sounds pretty mundane to me. We'll see what we can dig up. I gotta say, I'm pretty excited about orbit. I have a very special place in my heart for astrophysics. Let me be very clear. I just really bad at math and don't necessarily understand all the science that goes into it, but I'm very fascinated by space exploration and by the two competing theories of physics. So orbit to me gets me pretty excited thinking about all of the things happening in that space right now and all of the things that can happen in that space. So I don't want to get too overly excited, but I will say on a 1 to 10 with orbit, I gotta give it like a 7.5. I want to go 8, but I don't want to get too excited. So we're gonna go with 7.5.
Nice. I thought you might go 8 or even 9. Yeah. The second it popped up, I'm like, ooh, Alison's gonna love this one.
I know, but I've got to rein it in. So
yeah, no, it's good. And audience, just so you know, like this gut reaction, this rating, you'll see us come and visit this. So Alison just gave this like a 7.5, I think you said, right? We'll come back after we've researched at the rest of the end of this episode. It'll have been a week for us. I know I keep saying that, but we'll then, after our whole conversation, kind of rate it again. Because I think what we'll find, and hopefully what you find, is our gut reaction to a word may be very different after we, research it for a bit. We may take something that we thought we'd have no interest in and find some fascinating connection for us in how it pertains to the world. So that's sort of a part of our cycle too, in our format. So then I'll go. My gut reaction. How do I want to rate this? Very similar to Alison. I was like, ooh, that's cool. There's so much going on right now with NASA and the deep space images and everything else. Not that that's in orbit. Actually, it's not in orbit, but I too am excited. And I'll share. I don't know if I'm going to do this, but part of my joy of words is like the etymology of this might be that I find that there's something about orbit that predates our space understanding of orbit to see if it comes from something else, social orbits, or where like the background is. So I don't know. I'll see where I take it. I'm going to go with 7, 2. You were 7.5. Yeah. I'm going to go with 7. I think this is a good one.
All right.
It could have been like mud or something. And like, as we joked about, like just do mud, but I'm sure that even that would be fascinating if we get
actually, I mean, yeah, we, as Mark said, we did use it as one of our examples, I think, when we were testing the word generator several weeks ago. And I thought, well, primordial ooze. I mean, that's pretty interesting. The beginning of life. What's going on right now? Like looking for life on Mars or the moon where there's evidence of water, right? So you see how this starts to bring us down the rabbit hole. So 7 and 7.5, pretty close. I'm really excited to see after a week for us, hour and a half for you guys watching, if we come back to that same rating. So I think it's, thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to start this journey with all of you. And as Mark said, we'd love any feedback you have. So please feel free to get in touch with us and with that, Mark, is there anything else? Yeah,
no, I think that's it, folks. You could just continue to watch. I'll probably just dim the screen to black. And again, when you see us here in another 10 seconds, a week will have passed for us, but for you, just moments. So we'll talk to you in a moment.
Welcome back, everyone. It's been just a few seconds for you, but it has been a week for Mark and myself researching the word orbit. So we're going to jump right in, unless there's anything you want to say, Mark.
No, I'm excited to jump in and do this. It was a good week, but we'll talk about that after. Let's tackle orbit here.
Excellent. So what we're going to do to determine who goes first each week is roll a die. So Mark, we'll have to have a little of the honor system here, right? But let's both roll. Oh, I got a lowly 2.
I got a 1. So you won. So everybody, the rule is highest goes first. That's hilarious.
All right. So I go first.
I'm going to take that not as a sign that we have the barest minimum understanding of orbit after our research. I'd like to think it's more than that. But it's,
oh my God.
It's a scary omen, 1 and 2. Okay, putting that aside. I was going to
say the universe is like,
like, see your research and yeah. All right, go ahead. Sorry, you won that. So dig in. Oh, I have to time you. So everybody, as a reminder, this is our quick hit. So because we're wordy people, nerds, proud nerds, I'm sure we have prepared statements that strain our 15-second limitation. I absolutely recorded mine and timed it. Not recorded it, but I timed it, and I think I'm straining mine. Anyway, okay, Alison, you go first. 15 seconds on the clock. Orbit is what? Go.
So I unexpectedly went down a literature and film rabbit hole with this one, which then led me in 2 other directions. So our social orbits and the importance of connection to the human species, and separately, the interplay between science and art.
Boom. You stopped with seconds to spare. You're at about 13 and a half seconds.
Look at that.
Nice. So science and art. Interesting. Okay.
All right, Mark. So hold on here. I am going to use the stopwatch and I will count you down. Okay. 3, 2, 1, go.
An orbit is the path of an object's movement through space, accounting for how that object is affected by other objects. The path is always elliptical, unless considering the orbits of quantum particles. Humankind's quest through history to explain the orbits of the planets laid the foundation for modern science.
Sorry, folks, we should get an actual buzzer. Otherwise, you're going to always have to hear me do that.
Oh, maybe I'll edit that in afterwards for fun.
Do you want to just restate that last sentence since I so rudely buzzed you?
Yes. Humankind's quest through history to explain the orbits of the planets laid the foundation for modern science.
All right. So a couple things. In my old work days at very large meetings, when you always wanted to keep your presenters on topic, I was once at a meeting in Europe where if you went over, they would play very loudly, volume 11 over the speakers, Finnish death metal. So just an option that we can consider.
So when I'm editing, I could do Finnish death metal instead of buzzers.
It's so funny because it will shut anyone up.
That's hilarious. Now, the thing is, that would just be for our audience's sake, because I'm going to edit that in afterward. But maybe we could find some way to do it for each other. That would be more fun. We'll figure that out.
It really will. But other than that, Mark, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as this is the first time that it's going to be a lot of exciting, compare and contrast types of things. I feel like the straight-laced little dork who is like giving a definition, but then saying how that definition could be expanded and everything else. I love that you had this more felt like you're going to go, well, I'll find out here in a minute. But like you said, like film and art and a representation of orbits used in a less book sense, less straight definition and scientific sense. Am I right there?
Yes and no. It's interesting that you said book. I'll leave it at that for the moment. I love your direction. I do, because that is just the little geek in me was so excited, as you'll recall from several minutes ago, listeners, that when we got orbit, right, that, thinking about all the stuff going on in the science space. And while I didn't go in that direction, I'm really excited you did, so that we can talk about it.
Nice.
So should we jump into the zoom out?
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone, again, just because this is the first time, the zoom out, we're going to just literally zoom out. You saw us try to concentrate where we focused in our research for the past week, down to a 15-second little seed, a core. One might almost say a center of mass that creates orbits. Oh my goodness. So now we'll blow things out, zoom out into other relevance and broader connections. So Alison, you won this dice toss today, so take it away.
Okay, so dear listeners, you don't know us yet, but if you did know me, you would be pretty certain, I think we've alluded to this, that I was going to just go on nonstop and not shut up about the James Webb Telescope and the recent first images for this entire episode when we got orbit. That just seemed too easy. So I started poking around and exploring some different avenues. And lo and behold, I came across a short film from 2019 called Orbit. So after looking down a few other avenues, I thought, well, this seems interesting. So you can see it on YouTube. It's about 20 minutes long. I'm not going to tell you to go put it at the top of your next movie to watch list, but if you are an Edgar Allan Poe fan, you might want to, because I started watching it and thought very quickly, why does this feel familiar? It's a sci-fi take on Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. So you combine great literature and sci-fi, and I am there for it, right? So then at that moment I went, yep, this is the avenue I'm going down, even though I had a few other ideas kind of in my mind.
Nice.
So, yep, so super exciting, right? Poe, a master. So for those of you who've never read The Telltale Heart or just need a refresher from middle school English, Poe wrote this story in 1843, and it's told in the first person. And the narrator, the gender is never defined. So we don't know male or female. So I'm going to say they. So the narrator spends the story trying to convince the reader that they are sane, while at the same time detailing a murder they have committed with very little provocation. It's a very interesting story. And subsequently, said narrator, who has buried the body under the house, can hear with growing urgency and volume the beating heart of the murder victim. So there's a lot of things we could talk about there. But in the film, two men are alone on a spacecraft orbiting a planet, and one, murders the other. And the younger man murders the older man because the older man's pale blue eye of a vulture is driving him to distraction. They use direct lines from the story. This is not like a subtle remake of, they are saying lines from the story, and that is one of them. Aside, I had forgotten the eye part completely from the story and immediately thought, oh my God, orbital ridge. This is another avenue to pursue. I reined myself in. But before I dive a little deeper here of where this took me, Mark, do you remember reading did you read The Telltale Heart when you were in middle school?
I don't know, because I'm not remembering the history of it. I went through this period in like junior high school of buying like the big Shakespeare, the big, collection of all the greats. And I think the one that I ended up knowing the best, of course, was like, Nevermore and things like that. Because in school, I studied acting and directing at NYU. We had to do a puppet theater presentation. And so we did one of Nevermore and like actually how you brought that mood to life, the Raven, how the Raven could be represented in like darkness and everything else. But that is not The Telltale Heart. So yeah, I never did. So I'm gonna love learning more about like this whole thing. This is great.
Yeah, and I think we will, of course, link in our show notes all sorts of things, including links to this movie and the story and all of those things.
And forgive me, Alison, if you know at the top of your head here, it was, how recent was this film?
2019. I want to say 2019. Let me see if I made myself
like in the last few years. Got it. It wasn't like
yeah. Cool. Very, very recent. 2019.
Nice.
So okay. So there's the basis. And this got me thinking about a few things. So the sci-fi direction that I took, I think makes sense in general, right? Because sci-fi tends to have a lot of orbiting things, planets, moons, spacecraft, satellites, all of that. But with the short itself, after I watched it, I was thinking about how in art is often recreating or trying to re-represent things. And in this case, the directors wanted to create an homage to Poe's classic tale. And interestingly, Poe's been called one of the earliest sci-fi authors because he did sometimes in his stories incorporate themes of space, time travel, science, mesmerism, and all of that kind of naturally came from his time. So in the early 19th century, scientific discovery was skyrocketing. Definitely pun intended. So many things were happening in that space, like theory of electromagnetism was being developed. Atomic theory was developed by John Dalton. Ohm's law came into space. Vitalism was refuted because they were able to synthesize urea. Michael Faraday and others figured out how to alloy iron to stop oxidization, which has like massive implications on so many things that we take for granted today. So that was all happening around Poe, and he was working these things into some of his stories. But as much as he incorporated these themes, it turns out he had a pretty ambivalent stance towards science. So he was all very interested in it, but he was healthily skeptical. And he actually, I had no idea until this week, he wrote a poem called To Science. And he's basically arguing in this poem that science is the enemy of the poet because it takes away the mysteries of the world. And one of the lines from this poem is, "Why preyest thou thus upon the poet's heart, vulture, whose wings are dull realities?" Quick aside here, 14 years later, when he writes The Telltale Heart, he describes the cloudy eye of the murderee as the eye of a vulture. I don't think he was writing an allegory about murdering science, but I just thought this was an interesting tie-in. So his main concern was actually that science sacrificed creativity, where what he believed true science should do is require like intuitive imagination. So he was really like torn between these two things. So to recap, a movie short called Orbit, it's created as a remake, an homage really, to Poe's Telltale Heart. Poe been called one of the earliest science fiction writers, so this is kind of fitting, but he struggled with that interplay between science and art. And yet this sci-fi short is art. So we've kind of come full circle, right? We've gone all the way around, just like an Orbit. And then I will add to this that I watched a second film called Orbiter 9. It's a Spanish film from 2017. And it's about a woman alone on a spaceship who's had no human contact until an engineer has to come dock. Again, I'm not going to recommend that you add it to the top of your list, but if you are a sci-fi fan, it does add something new, I think, to the whole sci-fi catalog. I definitely would watch it if you are a fan. But the movie opens with shots of her doing everything alone. She's living alone on this ship, and I just made me immensely sad starting to think about that level of loneliness and how as human beings, we are biologically wired to need interaction as a species. It's so critical to us that solitary confinement is used as a punishment, I believe, in all cultures. I couldn't quite do all the research, but I believe in all cultures. And before the formal penal systems were developed in most cultures, banishment was used as a punishment for the most serious of crimes and was often a death sentence. So that is how like critical interaction is to us. And here this movie starts by focusing on this young woman who's been alone. It's so critical that we're connected that I read an article a number of years ago in National Geographic on brain development. And it turns out our brains aren't fully developed until our 20s. And any of you who have teenagers, I'm sure know this, like their risk reward system isn't there yet. So they make decisions that you just cannot contemplate how they're doing it. Mark and I do not have teenagers, but I think we know enough teenagers that this makes sense. And, if you have a teenager who has fallen out with their clique of friends, they will act like it is the end of the world. That is because, argues this article, their brain is telling them it is the end of the world. We are biologically wired to need that. So they're not just overreacting and being angsty teens. Their brain is telling them that this is something that's critical to survival. Anyway, this woman, meets an engineer and is, of course, desperate for connection. I am not going to spoil anything here. There are some twists in this movie that were quite interesting. And he also has a small robot, and she ends up talking to it. And she understands it's not human. She's that desperate. And for me, that made this perfect connection to everything I was just talking about, the science and art piece, because it's, science and desperation as human beings. Now there is this scientifically created robot, but she needs to use her imagination to try to interact with it. So it's those two pieces coming together. So that was a very long, little windy rabbit hole, but I will stop there and see what you think, Mark.
No, I think it's fascinating that like the curtailing of a social orbit like would have such detrimental effect, and that it seems like what you expose yourself to in these films is a bit of an exploration of that, right? Like you mentioned solitary confinement and why that is so awful, but also probably therefore why it's used. And when I was starting to think about the research, it crossed my mind, the different uses of the word orbit. And we talk about social orbits. And if someone's in your orbit, it almost makes me think more of like Victorian times, where it was something around like how structured family events were. And if someone was in your orbit, it really meant something about the social circles you traveled in. Anyway, down my own rabbit hole there. But I know I like the color and the different angle you took to it, which is pretty cool. I might have to check those out. For sure.
Yeah, I think you in particular would enjoy these, knowing your film tastes. So let's take it more sciencey. Why don't you share your take with us?
A little bit. It's funny that you mentioned the orbit of the eye. I think in some of the Telltale Heart stuff you were talking about, right? Yeah. I think it's interesting that I started a little bit there in terms of I love the history of where words come from and so on. And for me, it becomes, it always runs into obviously Greek, Mesopotamian, like the history of where our concepts of certain phrases and things came from. Why were we talking about orbits in ancient times? And what did we mean? Like, because we're coming into it, I'm going to be very honest, audience. I love this process already because it's almost embarrassing how much I don't know. But then that becomes something is so celebrated in science that the more you research and learn, the more you realize, oh, there's much more to that rabbit hole to go down. So I started with, looking at the word orbit. And of course, it says in the late 14th century, that was related to the eye socket and the round socket of the eye, which makes sense because around that time, it's going to be something physically so available to us to think of. But then I started thinking, well, is that coming from what? Is it round because that's what they called the eye socket, or was it round because it represented something else? And so looking back, you get all the way back to the Latin word orbita, which actually meant a wheel track, or the beaten path or a rut or in mud from a wheel. So that for me, it was fascinating too. Like that you go back farther and you get something that's actually closer to our understanding of an orbit in astronomy, which is actually a path through space. It was a path in mud left by a circular object, a wheel, but it was really the path, not the thing. Is that like completely odd? Like that blew my mind for some reason, which is, showing my nerd background, but I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. And then nobody knows where that came from. You kind of run up against that as like the beginning of that concept. Orbita, nobody knows where it came from before that, apparently. Anyway, that got me thinking. And so to your point, went full, exploration of, all right, orbits. When did we consider something being or having an orbit? When was this being talked about? And so for me, that ended up going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. But it also led me to realize through my research that what happens, I think, so much in our Western education system is we talk about the Greeks. However, the Greeks captured through their writing system and through just the course of time that their works survived, they pulled from Mesopotamian work. Egyptian work, that whole other sort of Fertile Crescent area that they were pulling from. So I just wanted to shout that out, right? It's, we don't say, oh, the Greeks started it all. Well, they were also standing on the shoulders of previous giants themselves, I think. So what I found fascinating was that this whole process for me brought the timeline of the evolution of what an orbit is through and organized it for me. I think before this week, I probably would just very vaguely be like, I think Kepler did some stuff. And, oh, right, Galileo, everybody knows him, not just from the song, but because of his telescope. And somewhere in the 1600s, and yeah, he was persecuted, but I can't remember if he recanted it. Like, I would have just been like, oh, yeah, and then Newton came along and everything was fine. Like, it'd be so broad, and that's embarrassing almost in a way, right? To like say that, but hopefully I'm not alone there, right? That we have these like general backgrounds, but then we're like, oh wait. So I loved sitting down. I love that we're doing this. I'm excited even just for this first week. So, all right, not to go too far, but what I have here in my notes, right, is to just sort of sketch out, and this can be good for me to try to encapsulate it in an arc rather than just detailing it. So picture ancient civilizations looking up and realizing, okay, the stars in their pattern are pretty uniform and set, but the planets were weirdos. And planets were moving in this spiral that almost wound and then unwound itself. Whereas the stars were behaving very differently and much more, I don't know, they sort of much more understood or not static. We know they move, but they were not erratic in their movement. So it felt like if you're in that time period, you could picture them being on this sphere that was somehow rotating or moving around you, right? The ancient Greeks literally pictured it on another, like we were on a, oddly, they knew the world was round. And that they were on like another sphere out in space. So when things were moving in this uniform way, it made sense to them. But the planets were confounding. And so that was like the seed of this huge, from there through to Newton, through honestly to Einstein, of understanding what the hell is going on with the planets and therefore orbits and therefore all of it, right? So I'll pause there just as a dork to say, throughout this whole process, I got like kind of emotional in how amazing the human spirit is to keep looking at things and saying why. You know what I mean? Like, I just think it's a testament to, it sounds schlocky, but like the human spirit to be like, well, why? Because I think there were, and I'm not saying that was everybody, right? It wasn't all of the Greeks doing this. There are people out in the fields defending, doing their thing, surviving, doing what they can. But just to not be there and be like, sure, they're weird, but who cares, right? Those planets are odd. But to keep having it almost gnaw away at human curiosity and consciousness until it's like this baton pass from one person to the next over so many years. So I really appreciating this after my whole journey. The hits of this, right? Fails of Militus. We're talking about 600 before the Common Era, was just movement in the heavenly bodies, right? That the planets were different, that there were bodies out there. It was Pythagoras, though, 525 BCE, who actually said the Earth is a sphere. Pause there again. Like, I don't know, Alison, maybe like you, we grew up being like, in 1492, Columbus sailing proved it, and everybody thought the world was flat. And now I think there were plenty of people who did still in 1492.
Well, sadly, there still are, right?
Well, yeah, right. Sadly, exactly. Thank you for bringing that up. But it is so, I didn't know, and maybe everyone else knew this. I think I knew in general that maybe some of the Greeks thought that, but not that Pythagoras, like one of the stars that everybody knows from like high school math, knew that, right? Or postulated that. And then that was kind of accepted. So that's kind of fascinating. But then standing on Pythagoras, you had Aristotle come in. There was some discussion around the geocentric versus heliocentric debate. And so for me, that kind of became the heart of where I went with this, which is not a surprise because it triggers the intense debate of what that means for religion versus science. And like the two tracks that we take from this time period around the beginning of the Common Era through to the 1700s, right? This massive exchange. And I learned a lot. I thought it was the classic big, bad, awful church, because I'm a raging atheist, against, right, holding back science and the progress. But I found out that it's a bit more complicated than that. So fast forwarding ahead, right? You have Aristotle established geocentrism. Ptolemy, I should say, in 150 Common Era, writes a massive treatise on physics and the movement of the spheres, which really kind of solidifies geocentrism again. And that sort of stands, but it's so complicated. The more that they tried to explain these aberrations and this erratic movement, they were very, very well informed. They were able to try to estimate the size of things and so on, but they kept having observations of the natural world that weren't, making sense. So they kept getting more and more complex. So picture, right, you probably remember the spheres we all see with the Earth in the middle, and the sun going around it. Well, Ptolemy has not only a planet circling the Earth, but also circling in its own circle. And then others circling around that. And it's just this crazy massive circle. And so you get to Nicolaus Copernicus, Polish, 1473. It stands for that long. This insane, overly complicated geocentric model stands from 150 Common Era to 1540 or so, which is astounding kind of unto itself. But of course, we had the Dark Ages in there and everything else. So Copernicus thinks that this is sort of unacceptable, that nature can't be that erratic. He was actually he was a religious person. He just thought he was such a conservative in how nature should behave that it was just too crazy to have all these circles, basically. And so he posits that for the first time, someone tried to, back in Aristotle's time, say, no, I think the sun is probably in the center. But Aristotle basically just dismissed it because it was too revolutionary. It went counter to a lot of the thinking that, we were the center of everything. But oddly, there was also a question of the size of the stars, right? They didn't have Galileo's telescope yet. They were doing a lot of math to do the size of stars versus the Earth. But if Copernicus was right, it wasn't just that we weren't at the center. It did things to the size of stars as they were understood, and the distance of stars, which I thought was fascinating. I always think it's like this reversal of if we're in the center or not, almost like a weird human ego thing. It was actually not just frowned upon by the church for being a sort of tumultuous upheaval of church doctrines, but even I looked into it. I never realized Tycho Brahe, Danish astronomer, kind of the superstar in Europe astronomer at Copernicus's time, respected Copernicus's thoughts on it, but didn't buy it because he thought it would mean the stars were so far away. And that's ridiculous. It just didn't stand up.
Just a side note, he was actually Brahe was I didn't know that's how you pronounced it. So thank you. An answer to New York Times crossword puzzle clue this week.
Oh, nice. Oh, excellent. Did I say Tycho? Because I had to look it up. And yeah,
Oh, no, Brahe.
Tycho Brahe. Yep.
Yeah.
I wanted to say Tycho, but that was one of the first things I learned was Tycho Brahe. So he had a very well-reasoned and I loved reading about him because it wasn't this I feel like in our modern era, especially now, given geopolitics, it feels like this fierce, everybody will hate someone else's debate or agreement. He just felt very passionately that Copernicus was making, either stars wildly massive or very far away, et cetera, et cetera. So he actually, and I never knew this existed, I feel like it was always geocentrism or heliocentrism. He posited a combination of the two, which he called like geoheliocentrism. And it was interesting. He had all the other planets other than Earth orbiting the sun, but then the sun orbiting the Earth. Right? If you can picture that. So the Earth is there with our moon, and the sun is orbiting us.
And we're all going around.
But everything else is orbiting the sun. So the sun's going around, all the other planets going around the sun, and then just the sun's orbiting us and the moon.
Wow.
So
we're very
for
important.
Him, exactly. For him, though, that again, if the audience wants to delve into this, brought things together. I know I'm going like way long. The only other thing that I want to bring up, I'll touch on this, is a massive topic unto itself, but the whole church side of this, right? So that was like the scientific, I'd say, like hesitance and disagreement with him, which was actually well thought through and grounded in scientific thought at the time with Tycho and everyone that was following him. So it wasn't like Copernicus like necessarily had a breakthrough in all science. It was like, yes. But from a fascinating, I think, religious standpoint, I think we all may know in some ways that Galileo was put on trial, had to sort of recount, so on, his belief. So for folks who don't know, I had to remind myself, he basically witnessed through his telescope moons around Jupiter. And so once you had proof that something was circling something other than the Earth, you basically shifted the Earth from being the focus of everything, right? It's like, oh, other heavenly bodies are centering around other things. We are not the only thing tying all of this heavenly movement together. He was on trial, did not die. As we know, he was not put to death. What's fascinating, though, for two reasons, is this guy named Giordano Bruno, an Italian, lived from 1548 to 1600. He became sort of ravenously an advocate for Copernicus's heliocentric model. But he, as opposed to, say, Galileo or Tycho, was kind of more of a wild philosopher and had political aspirations for what he wanted to do. And there was so much going on with like the Reformation, and sort of the Inquisition was spreading across Europe. So really, Copernicus was at the end of like this freedom to have his theory published, and then everything kind of started to get washed under the Inquisition. It was kind of wild. But Bruno basically took it farther. And although he was sort of this crazy historical figure, he actually posited that now we know if the Earth is revolving around the sun, then that continues. And the sun must be revolving around something else, et cetera, et cetera. And I didn't know this. I had to look it up and realize that just continues to literally the edge of human knowledge right now. We know that our sun is revolving and orbiting around a black hole in the middle of the Milky Way. And then if I'm going to get this right, the Milky Way is revolving around the center of gravity of a group of galaxies. And if you go out from there, the galaxies are forming on threads of dark matter at the very edge of like known anything. So Giordano Bruno, who was imprisoned for 8 years for his support of Copernicus and then burned at the stake, turns out to be, yes, a sort of erratic, kind of crazy guy, but actually nails the I don't know how to put it, the puzzle within the puzzle within the puzzle of known space, and how there really isn't a center to anything. So So yeah, I'll wrap that up with just, after that, you basically have these things hanging in the air until you've got Kepler comes in. He was a student of Tycho Brahe. So even though Tycho didn't agree with Copernicus, Johannes Kepler defended and validated Copernicus. And also finally was the first time, I didn't bring this up the whole time, all of this thinking was in circles. So Johannes Kepler said these are elliptical orbits. And then all of this as to why goes to Sir Isaac Newton having his 3 laws of motion, where you finally understand a gravitational force and why these things are circling around each other. And then fast forward that to what I just learned today when I brushed up on relativity theory, is nothing's just oddly attracted to each other. 4-dimensional space is curved and things are actually, in a way, rolling towards each other. There is no odd attraction between objects. An object, the sun, is warping time-space. And in a way, the Earth is constantly just rolling downhill in 4 dimensions. Sorry, that's my rabbit hole.
That is an amazing rabbit hole. I have all these comments I want to make. I think maybe in the future I'll jump in, because now some of them
I was just rambling.
I don't want you to be sorry. I didn't want to I didn't want to mess with that flow, but some of my comments go back to what you said a while ago.
We could go back.
But talking about the origin of the word itself is so fascinating when you were talking about how it's actually kind of meant the rut of a wheel. Part of me was going, oh, of course it did. I mean, not necessarily of a wheel, but of course it was about something round, or the toll doing so. It just, my brain never would have kind of thought that before. The other thing I just thought I'd share with folks, if you haven't been to Pompeii in Italy, it is mind-blowing, and I highly recommend it. But I thought one of the coolest things when I was there several years ago is there are still wheel ruts in the road that were made by carts from way back then that have been preserved. And it's something as little as that really makes you feel mind blown and connected to the place. Interestingly, Pompeii, it was a center of commerce for the region. So merchants and farmers were coming there to sell their wares often. And there was a standard across the region, a standard wheel width on carts. And in Pompeii, in any city back then, once the ruts kind of were formed in the street, well, that's what they were. And they changed the width so that farmers and merchants who came to town would have to pay to rent a special cart to get in. So kind of greed and commerce at its best, even way back then. I think we can think about how things don't change. I also very much appreciated your shout out to the Fertile Crescent, because it just made me feel like, 6th grade social studies all over again. And I think so much of what you said too, some of it connected actually, even though we took such different tracks, to what I was talking about. And some of this I think will come up in my big question when we get to that in a minute, but the why of the human spirit. And I think that in sci-fi movies and books, you see that a lot, right? That tends to be an underpinning theme of the human race, striving to understand more. It's what still to this day is driving NASA, in fact. And then religion versus science, which it quite frankly is still a war that's going on. You also look at art versus science, right? So you and I were looking at science as something that also, it has provided and given us all these amazing things, all this amazing knowledge, also continues to not necessarily sit comfortably in the human experience, which I think is really, really interesting. And then I'll save one other thing to tie it in with my big question, but
wait, let me jump. Finish that thought before you leave the science versus the church. Just even in my research, when I found some of my research came from Scientific American, and folks will post. I have a work cited. I think Alison probably does too. We'll post those in the show notes and also on the website. So you can check out these things, check our research or delve deeper yourself. But it was interesting that when I found an article called The Case Against Copernicus, I think that's the name of it. I might be butchering the name, but again, it'll be in the show notes, everyone. It was the story of Tycho Brahe's very thoughtful disagreement with Copernicus, which was meant to sort of show the other side of what I thought. It wasn't just like everybody thought this was the right way, and it was the church being like, no. That was still happening. But even after they published that, another thing I found was someone wrote in, I might probably quote some of it in the episode notes as well. Want to find this guy because he seems like he'd be a good guy to know. He just agreed, but he also wanted everybody to know, like, don't discount how horrifying the Inquisition's impact was on scientific thought. I think we all know that, right? Like, I mean, people were burned at the stake. Poor Giordano was, burned at the stake for this. So even now, even when we thoughtfully balance out the equation, so to speak, with like this story of Tycho, you're right that we shouldn't lose sight of it. It's just constantly this give and take. And other articles I found were from like the 70s, which were trying to like say, are we sliding back into like a modern Inquisition? Now, this was 1973, and they were calling out Nixon. They were calling out the treatment of nuclear physicists by the USSR, who were suddenly being like, because they were disagreeing with the government, their whole lives were being torn apart. So it's just fascinating that you underscore that, because yeah, it's still happening. And I don't know, unfortunately, if it ever will go away, but.
Yeah, no, actually, first of all, I want to say that I love that after your week of research, you seem to be on a first name basis with all of these famous scientists, like Giordano and Tycho, my boys.
My buds.
That's actually perfect that you brought that up, because, and that you did a call out to some of these guys, because one thing I was just going to share, not this week, not for this, but sometime in the past year, I watched all of Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos, and it's an update, like so much, right? Another remake of Sagan's Cosmos from, I'm a child, as is Mark, of the 70s and 80s, right? So something I used to watch on public television when I was a kid. And I highly recommend it, because a lot of the characters that Mark mentions, he has episodes on that go, he just scratches the surface, because you can't do much more in an hour-long episode, but you learn a lot more about some of the folks that Mark's talking about and some of the struggles at the time. So highly recommend that. We'll link that as well in the show notes.
Thanks. Did you, I know I cut you off to mention the church science debate. Did I cut you off from?
No, I was going to go into, I was going to go into Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Oh, perfect. All right. I think we can probably tease up some of our brass tacks questions. So folks, this is a section where we try to think through, how it was, what, I don't know, provocative questions or thoughts or perspectives. I almost wanted to say bleak questions. Maybe they're bleak. Reveal something about my approach to things. Just questions that, going down this rabbit hole for us both brought up. So Alison, do you want to share some of yours?
Sure. So, thinking about the big questions, big questions often don't have answers. So I don't know what the answer is to these, but I talked about kind of two different things. I talked about social orbits and how biologically wired we are to need them. And I also talked about the intersection of art and science, and that's where I wrapped everything up. So I really stuck with the intersection of art and science. And so my question is, unsurprisingly, are art and science complementary or at war? You could say the same thing about religion. So you do have prominent religious leaders who rail against science. I was going to say, I'm sorry if this offends anybody, but you're not listening to us if this offends you. I mean, you haven't even found us yet. So there are people who don't believe dinosaurs existed because it doesn't, who truly in this day and age don't believe that because it doesn't fit in. But at the same time, you have prominent religious leaders who say science and religion are hand in hand, to determine the true nature of God and our existence is religion. And I think that, in my opinion, is a much more beautiful and comprehensive answer. So, but unfortunately, I think they are still at war. Other kind of examples there. I mean, science just creates some of the biggest. Think of pictures of fractals that we've seen, and our understanding of fractals is completely based on math and science, and they are naturally created some of those beautiful things in the world. You hear numerous scientists talk about how without intuition, you don't get breakthroughs. You can do all the controlled experiments you want, but there needs to be some level of intuition to get there. I believe Einstein had a quote or two on this, but I purposely did not want to quote Einstein because he has been misquoted so much, especially like in the past decade. And I didn't want to even risk, going down that rabbit hole. You also have someone, some of you may have heard of a man named Edward Tufte, who is still alive. He was a statistician, professor at Princeton, professor at Yale. And he wrote 3 gorgeous books on the visual representation of statistical data. He also is a sculptor. But that idea that like a statistician, a mathematician, a scientist is interested in and focused on how we represent that visually for human beings to best understand it, but also in a way that is beautiful and artistic. So I think there are plenty of examples about how science and art can coexist. And finally, we do have Einstein, not going to quote him, like I said, but you do have, when we think about Poe talking about science can potentially kill creativity and kill intuition, Einstein talks about spooky action at a distance. Right. So in physics, originally the thought was, and Mark, you like grazed on this, you touched on this a little bit. And that's why I was like, oh, this really figures into like theories of physics, right? Figure into my big question. This idea of quantum mechanics. So the idea that things don't move unless there's a force like gravity acting upon them. But then Einstein and others started to see examples of like things moving and we can't explain why. Doesn't mean there isn't a why. It means we can't explain it yet. There certainly is. But the idea that something can be moved without being physically touched by another object or another force like gravity really then created this problem between the predominating theories of physics, right? Between relativity and quantum mechanics. And they still haven't figured it out. They have plenty of theories, but astrophysicists still haven't figured it out. And to get there, you do have to take a creative leap because nothing we know or have can give us the answer to that. So we have to be rethinking things in new ways that we're not going to get just necessarily from doing the math. And the math doesn't get us there. So I do think that science and art are connected, but then it brings us to the practical question. What should we be funding more? Do we fund NASA or do we fund the National Endowment of the Arts, which is more important for human survival? Or are they both really important because there's an interplay? So those are my big questions, Mark.
I will first applaud you for bringing those questions up and tussling with them. I sort of immediately, so audience, my background, I'm not going to hold myself up as like a serious artist, but I have spent a fair amount of time. I was trained in the performing arts and directing and theater and so on, and a love of classical arts and visual arts. But so for me, having written a fair number of papers in my formative years on art and the nature of it, but also having such a negative view of religion and its impact on society and behavior. So yeah, I when I hear this, I love the question. I sort of feel immediately that you're looking at art almost akin to a human, I don't know where I want to go with this, like a human identity that helps us deal with existential anxiety, like which bridges to religion for me, right? You're I think fusing art a little bit more with like a religious, I don't know, with a religious standpoint. For me, where I get sort of tangled up here and where I may I don't know if it's quite disagreeing with you, but it's art to me is nothing more than, I'm gonna have to quote good old Shakespeare here, but putting the mirror up to nature, right? It is to see a representation of what we as humans experience, wrestle with day to day, and in just framing it by taking it out of our head and making it something we can all collectively observe, therefore sparking debate about it, exploration of it. I have never had this thought, I don't think, before, but like I wouldn't be surprised if theater was some sort of precursor to psychology in some way. Now I want to follow that up because
I feel like there are definitely books on this.
I'm like, there's gotta be like, I'm curious because right. You're observing and you're observing yourself. If you are, you're putting things up on stage to be reflected, right? The mirror up to nature. So in that, I feel like you treasure and explore what we don't understand, and science then, I don't know, for me, I guess doesn't explain it away, but they feed off of each other. There's this celebration of what it means to be human, what we don't know and what we struggle with, but then science is how we actually pursue it. So for me anyway, I guess that's the difference. I feel like they do live hand in hand because I think they're feeding off of each other. I don't think one is fighting against the other. Like I would disagree with Poe where he's like, science kills it. I don't know. Maybe that's just my nature. I don't see that as killed. I like that it's explained because for me, I think there's always the next level. If we're being good old Giordano, my bud Giordano again, you find the center of one system. That system itself is connected to another system. It's connected to something else. So I don't know that we're ever going to suddenly be like, we've killed all of curiosity. I don't know. Right. Am I rambling? I'm probably rambling.
No, you're not. You and I are unsurprisingly completely aligned on this. I think I wanted to ask the question because I do think it still rages. And I do think there are people who think, it's one or the other that's more important. Art's not giving us enough. We need to be funding science. It's going to save more lives, right? Would be like an argument from one side. The other side would be very much like you said, without art, are we even human? So I 100% agree with you. I may have misled you a little bit when I was talking about the religion piece, which I was only talking about because you were bringing up religion and science.
Right.
So
okay. Yeah.
I think I spun off. I don't think art is necessary. I think it can be a stairway to the divine, to touching the divine. But, my religious views are very similar to yours. So it's not like I'm,
because I do think
that's what it's for. I think it is for exactly what you said. It's a way to put out there what's going on inside. It's a way to reflect ourselves. It's a way to have society reflect and move on in new ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think what you were describing, that the negative, like I think religion and science, for sure, are diametrically opposed because that brings in an attack on a comfort and an identity that either a human being or a society has locked in place to deal with existential anxiety. I don't want to fly into Sartre and bad faith or anything. Maybe hopefully that comes up in one of our random nouns where we get to go down that rabbit hole. But you know what I mean? That's the only thing that when that gets locked in, that is harder to unlock and overturn than an established theory. What I love about Tico's part of this story was, although he felt very strongly, clearly, that he disagreed with Copernicus, he was thoughtful in it, and wasn't just because his sense of self rided on his theory. Now, maybe there's some of that in a professional sort of astronomer circle. You put your heart into something, you kind of want it to be right. But I love that he overturned it, and that his own student was Kepler, who aligned with Copernicus. I respect the scientific community so much in that, because I just feel like in religious circles, you'd never see that.
Right. No, I agree.
You know what I mean? You wouldn't see that attack and freedom to overturn. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, literally.
No, it's good.
Not literally.
A lot of puns today. A lot of puns.
I know. Wait. Oh, sorry. Go on. There's definitely one of my questions that absolutely plays into one of yours, but hit it. Go.
Well, actually, let's get to I was just going to say, I did inadvertently take us down a whole other rabbit hole by tying it back into religion, which had nothing to do with my original question. But I'm glad I did, because it brought us to this conversation. But I just thought of something while you were talking that I originally, surprisingly, had not thought about as kind of a wrap up to my big question before, which is one of, the greatest physicists of our time, who I already mentioned, Carl Sagan, who did so much to bring physics to all of us, to every man, to the non-physicist, right, through his show Cosmos, and who truly believed in teaching in that way.
He also led the Voyager project, and Mark knows I might get a little cheery here. So when Voyager was launched, containing all sorts of things relating to the human race, the idea being that it's launched into outer space so that if there is life out there and someone finds it, they have, there's a recording of a mother talking to a baby. There's just all these things, language, and a lot of it is art. And so Carl Sagan, one of our greatest physicists, realized that what's important, I don't remember exactly if it's a Bach sonata or, there's a piece of classical music. There's examples of music from around the world. There's all of Shakespeare's works or something like that. Please do not fact check me on exactly what's on there, but it is.
Or do, actually.
Or do and let us know. Right?
Yes, and let us know. For sure.
But that to me is so beautiful. That is the perfect combo of science and art, because a man who dedicated his life to understanding more about our universe also connected with the idea that art is what makes us so special and unique and should be one of the first things that we should share were we to find life somewhere else in the universe. Oh, I have goosebumps.
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up.
All right, let's go. That's perfect. Carl Sagan, into your big question, I think.
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember something you had said around the interplay of art and science. Oh, you know what it was? I think it was perhaps to understand some things within science, you need to think outside the box. Do you need to have an artist's imagination or spirit to think differently? Now that I say that out loud, this question is sort of the opposite of that. And it doesn't mean to be disagreeing with you, but I just think it's funny that because when I went through the history of heliocentric versus geocentric and how much through church circles or not, Tico was like a good example of how to overturn that and be thoughtful and just sort of flow with the best knowledge and the best theories that are backed up. But so many of the facts and background that I ran into was really just this sort of inertia. Sorry, little Newton. But you know what I mean? Like of thought that you really need to overturn because people, get subjective about things rather than objective. And so one of the questions I know we're supposed to maybe just have one big question. I have like three, but one of them is, can we ever truly create and institute a purely objective scientific method, or would that rely on AI being programmed as such? But even AI is programmed by humans.
Right. Okay. This is like a whole other episode, which I think when we thought this format through, you were like, this could lead to other episodes, but I'm not even going to let you answer it. I'm horrible. I apologize, but I'm so excited that you just asked this question. So I have long felt that, and this is not some unique thought on my part. The problem, huge believer in science here. I used to have like a mask that said science will win, right? So, huge believer in science. But the problem for me with the scientific method has always been that the scientific method is developed by human beings who don't understand everything there is to understand about science, about how the universe works, about all the forces around us. Dark matter, we don't know. Oh, it's there. It's like more of it. Suddenly, what? We don't know. So it has to be inherently flawed. That being said, I think it's the best we have right now. It should be used. It shouldn't be doubted. But should it probably evolve over time as we learn more? Yeah, absolutely. Like all things. Like when you have an opinion on one thing and then you learn more stuff and you go, you know what, I was wrong. Or I need to tweak it. It's that sort of thing. So I do think that the scientific method is inherently flawed, although very, very solid in a lot of ways. And then when you bring it into AI, like you said, I think you answered the question. We're programming the AI. So at least initially, those same biases are going to be inherent there until the robots take over the world.
Just kidding. Sort of. I don't know. Am I?
No.
But
no,
until they develop their own
I'll
consciousness,
let you finish your thought.
Then who knows where they're going to go? Yep. But they've already been initially programmed by us, so they may go down the same path that we would have gone down anyway, or they just have so much more processing power at their fingertips that if they have fingertips, that maybe it goes another way. But I think too much bias is built in. But I honestly don't know. So what were you thinking about? Well,
here's exactly what I wrestled with, and this is where I feel sort of embarrassed. Like I have this fear that someone might stumble across our little podcast, and I hope they do, but I'm fearful that they listen to us, and if they've researched AI, I really I do want to pause. Alison and I know are on the same page with this audience. If you know of these topics, if you have heard us say something, I will not be embarrassed. I just said I was, but I will try not to be embarrassed. I will actually relish the opportunity to be corrected by folks who just have studied these things and know more. The spirit of this whole show is for Alison and I to celebrate and to be more curious and to realize things we didn't know before, or we may have associated, et cetera, et cetera. So if you know of these things and we've said something that has really pissed you off, or has really, you just like your head's exploding with how off base it is for some reason, we actually really want you to reach out. It could be anything. We might prompt you to send an audio recording, and you might be on the show. We might have people come be on the show as a follow-up to a topic months later. Who knows? So first, I just want the audience to know that, right? Second, with this whole concept, why I'm slightly embarrassed is because I realize we're not the first ones. Like in popular culture, I feel like we were just dancing around Terminator a second ago, right? Like the computer to take over the world, Skynet, all that. This concept of, is a stone cold robotic logic by and large the best good, or does it lead to horrific tragedy? It has been explored in many ways in such popular things as Ultron, the character in Marvel's. He is exactly what we're describing, which is slightly embarrassing because it's almost like movies have educated me, but it's not quite what I mean. But you know what I mean? That is the question inherent. He is an AI who realizes that is the most logical thing, that the human race is so screwed that it should just not exist anymore. So I guess what I mean here is, I had this follow-up question. Can AI ever erase the human subjectivity it was coded with? The human sort of bad faith. Oh my God, it's the second time I've mentioned bad faith. But then I have this big and bold thing of, should it, right? Because in so many of these explorations of thought in films and other things, is the saving grace that educates the robot is if they're slightly human enough that they respect life, that logic isn't always completely the right way. Where I get tangled around this even more is movies. And so that is to pull the heartstrings and make it feel right. But is there a way to show maybe pure logic really absolutely is the right way? I just don't know. And so that's where I have these questions of does human emotion always save us from atrocities? Is that really a thing? Or is that films teaching us that that's the end of the story we're used to telling?
No, I think that's a great point, because we've all seen so many of those movies, and look, a movie needs to pull at our heartstrings, right? I mean, there is a formula to some degree. But I think your Ultron, although I laughed and smirked when you brought that up as an example, is a perfect example, because that is pure logic of him saying, well, I'm here to protect the human race, to make sure, the only way to do it is eliminate them, because they are absolutely
right. I don't think I'm getting that wrong. Yeah, no, he tries to wipe everything. Yeah.
Everything out, because he's you guys are destroying yourself, everything, and you're evil, and you're doing all this stuff, and you're never going to change. So I have to start over. I have to build a new race.
Right. That's held up as the logic AI solution. Yeah.
But I think I think there's no answer to your question, and I think it's such an incredibly
fascinating one. And it made me just think of one thing you may have seen in the news. Many of you in the past few months, I believe there was an article, one of the lead AI engineers at Google made a statement and said, I think our AI has achieved actual independent consciousness. And everyone at Google was like, no, it did not. Just stop it. Like, you're spending too much time with it. You don't. And he was like, well, let me give you some examples of how, right? So this is a trained engineer. Obviously, was leading this project. He is no longer, and gave these sort of examples. Now, I don't know if he just kind of went off the deep end there because he's so deep in it, which I think would be very easy to do, or if he has a point and he's being hushed up, which does sound like a movie plot. But that is the interesting thing. We've all seen, before 2020, we all saw numerous movies, TV shows, read numerous books about a contagion, a plague, a spread, what that would be like for the human race. And we were like, yeah, sci-fi, whatever, wouldn't happen that way. And then here came COVID. Although none of us expected that like people would just refuse to wear masks, get vaccinated. Like that wasn't built into any of the movies, but
we probably should have, but yeah.
So the fact that we all watched these movies and went, well, it's all in all the movies, so it couldn't possibly happen that way. Well, maybe it could with AI. So that's a very long way of saying, I don't know the answer to your question.
Oh, I didn't know the answer to yours either. Like this is what the point is. I love these. I love this section. Yeah. Nice. I'm trying to think in interest of time, dear audience. I have some other questions, but maybe I'll post them in the show notes. Just other riffs on secular versus religious warring factions, which we have touched on already, to be honest.
Really?
I want to ask the question, but just an observation that I took away from this was, if Pythagoras posited that the world was round for certain reasons, and then 1492 rolls around and we're still trying to, like, most people don't buy it. It just feels like how tenuous the propagation and momentum of human knowledge is. Now, I think most of us now would say an amazing amount. Obviously, things have changed. The printing press, the basis of knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. But it got me thinking ahead to, again, disaster scenarios we see in films, but I think there's a reason why these things come up in directors and writers' minds. Is, are we doing enough that if things really cataclysmically went off the rails right now, how far would human society be taken back? All the research I just did was online. It required electricity. It required the internet. I know we have, obviously, libraries, but to what extent would human nature, like, if it was all obliterated, like everything other than printed things tomorrow? Just curious how much progress would be lost. You know what I mean? Because if I suddenly was stranded, me and Alison live in New York City, shit really went down in the world, and we are stuck somewhere in upstate New York and society falls apart. I don't know how. I barely know first aid, much less.
I took a week-long survival course in the woods. So
you know what I mean? Like, I know I'm going like a little crazy with that like thought, but I guess it's just that big question of, if I see that it's so easy for the world to have a true spherical understanding from Pythagoras, but then we're proving it still thousands of years later. Thousands of years later. I don't know. That just scares me. So I just want to make sure, like, even though we pride ourselves in our modern society, are we safe from that? Yeah. I don't think we can.
Yeah. And I know we have like a time constraint, but I will just say quickly, I love that thinking too. That is why some of the best sci-fi, I think, shows and books and movies, again, do actually focus on what does it look like to rebuild society. So instead of just being the great disaster or the zombie chase or whatever. And The Walking Dead, again, we could do a whole episode on this with people calling in, because people have very strong feelings about The Walking Dead. And I will say, I am still watching it. It's almost over, right? We have one more, like the last part of the last season coming up. I don't know when, soon. And it really, really, really had gone downhill, my opinion. I'm sure a lot of you have other opinions that you can write in and tell me I'm wrong. But one of the things I loved about it in the beginning is that it did, there were plenty of zombies and all that, but it did start to focus on what would you do? How would you live? And then once you got somewhere that was safe, how would you rebuild society? You don't even understand. How do you build a water wheel? I mean, just things like that. And they don't have access to it. And they don't have access to libraries because they're all full of zombies. So they don't even have that. And that to me is the most interesting part of a lot of the disaster movies that we end up seeing, how people envision society rebuilding.
There you have it, folks. Our true, you thought we were kidding when we started this episode saying we sometimes go down a rabbit hole. We're now talking about The Walking Dead and the preservation of human knowledge in general. We started with Orbit, but there you go.
It's pretty incredible.
And hope, I really have this fear, I'm just going to be very honest, audience, that I hope you're not listening being like, these guys are full of themselves. I think I want to make it clear, I'm acknowledging that I enjoy learning things and I enjoy trying to piece things together, but gosh, I feel very aswim in a swim. Is that what I mean? Adrift? There we go.
Adrift.
That's better. Swimming
at
and
sea.
Adrift. A swim. In a massive amount of ignorance. Yeah. My ignorance, my own ignorance, not other people's ignorance.
No, I want to fully agree with that. Mark already said this. I think it bears repeating. Well, actually, I think, Mark, it's probably time. This is a really good way to segue into the part we wanted to do to wrap up, which was talk about what this week was like. This was our first episode. And so what Mark just said, I would say, first of all, it was incredibly fun. And I thought a week, 7 days would be more than enough time. It is not, because you scratch the surface and then you're like, well, now I have to learn more about that. And then you scratch that surface and you could go forever, right? That rabbit hole never ends. Comes out all the way on the other side of the world. It's good science there. So that is fascinating. And what bears repeating is that there is so much. This just reminded me how much I don't know. Like Mark, I have incredibly broad interests, but I know a little about a lot of stuff. I don't know a lot about any one thing. And this just reinforced for me, I got very excited when I decided on my direction, and then it ended up being Edgar Allan Poe related. I mean, it was just like over the moon on that. And, but then realized I couldn't remember what years he was even writing. And, just there's just so much. So if you are a literature professor listening to this, you're thinking, she got the whole point of something or other wrong. I would love to know that. I do not.
Please, I couldn't remember the name of the poem. I called it Nevermore, and it's The Raven.
And I was like, The Raven.
Nevermore. I was like, yeah, I do remember that it's The Raven, everybody. If you're still listening after I couldn't remember an hour ago.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, and I'm an avid podcast listener myself. And I know for sure I'll sometimes hear people mention something and they won't give all the context about something I know about. And I'll be like, well, actually, the history of Ireland, you've left out this very important part. Okay. And then I have to rein myself in. But please, please, please share with us when you have.
Yes, you don't have to rein yourselves in, dear audience.
Exactly. I rein myself in on those podcasts. We do not want you reining yourselves in. So to sum up, I had a great week doing this. I wish we had more time. At the same time, if we had more time, we'd never stop, I think. So it made a lot of sense to go in this direction. And I could not be happier that we're starting this. So what about you, Mark? How was it for you?
I mean, a lot of the same. Had an absolute blast. Loved that putting in the time. I'll be honest, there were moments where it felt, because we put this, we gave ourselves homework. Just, I had that little childish reaction of oh God, I have to get my homework, just for a second. But then once I did it, so much joy coming out of unstructured, although it was homework, so to speak, this is us doing it out of a passion and love for it, right? So really, I experienced the opposite of homework. It was a very fun, untethered, no set path, delving into what I wanted to find. And to your point, is scratching the surface. I feel like I'm trying not to be embarrassed by how much I didn't cover, but of course we can't cover. I mean, it's inhumanly, it's not possible, right? To cover something in a short podcast with the depth that we might want. I want to give a huge shout out and a reminder to folks who potentially lose sight of it, as I did. I did so much of my research with my New York Public Library card number and accessing EBSCO and massive amounts of like online databases that you might forget, folks, that you have a lot of free access to through your public library. At least the New York Public Library has that. I would assume many do around the globe. So I had fun even in just like, not just what I learned, but how I was learning it and realizing, oh, cool, I can just go search on any topic and find these amazing sources from any time period. I mean, it's really rich resources that the library offers. So that was cool. What else?
While you're thinking, I'll add, I also used my library card. I'm a huge supporter of libraries and fan of libraries. So I'm really glad you called that out, Mark. For folks who maybe just haven't thought about a library in a while, get your library card wherever you are, support your local libraries. The other thing, I wouldn't have thought of this before you mentioned it. Another research tool I think all of us use in our daily lives now is Wikipedia, right? So wikipedia.org. Wikipedia.org is ad-free. It is run as a not-for-profit. If you are use it often, you'll sometimes see something pop up that asks you to donate. That is one I always donate to, because I think I use this site at least once a day. I can donate a small amount of money. Every sort of dollar counts for them. So if that is something that you use, I would urge you to consider helping to keep that an open source of information. It's a source of information people all over the world, if they have internet access, who might not have access to libraries, have access to. So I think it's an important basis of knowledge to keep people connected.
And if anyone has hesitance about that, this is a tricky thing to bring up, because I don't want anyone to think that I'm disagreeing with Alison at all. I like Wikipedia. I think it needs to be funded. But I think at the same time, I would love to learn more. So Alison, I may rely on you for that too, as friends, to do that. If you were raised in research a bit like me, where because of its open source nature, it can be tricky that it is not validated or can easily be led astray by some of the things we talked about today, actually, about like this sense of subjectivity versus objectivity. I think it's a fascinating experiment in like human history it's like the definition of truth being that everyone's able to see something and control it, right? So even if it does go astray, it is self-correcting because it's constant. But that takes people to fund it, to Alison's point. And excuse me if anyone can hear traffic here in New York City, it can get a little crazy. So that everyone is engaged with it and using it and funding it, because that actually helps propagate, I think, it being more of a resource, more accessible to people, but also more accurate to make sure that there aren't bad actors, so to speak.
Yeah. And I want to add to that, Mark. First of all, don't ever worry about disagreeing with me. That's part of the conversation. And number two, Mark is exactly right. Now, it is my understanding, vague understanding, I don't understand the details, that Wikipedia is much more kind of police than we think it is, that there are frameworks in there. That being said, there are absolutely opportunities, in my understanding, to, I don't know, put your own spin on something. So always, Wikipedia for me is a starting point. It's never the ending point. It's like an area that you get a basis of knowledge, and then you are always going to want to dive deeper, to Mark's point, and have actual hardcore sources. A lot of times in Wikipedia articles and other places that you'll start your research on anything, they will also have references that link you to where they got their information. That always, just like when, back in college with homework, you always want to be able to cite your sources, and you always need them to be reliable. So a place to start, not a place to, at the end of the day, rely on as the final knowledge in anything.
Yes. So only send me things that were written by AI, because that's all I trust. Oh, see what I did there? Brought it back. The AI library of 3022. Scary, but also kind of cool. I don't know what I'm talking about. All right, folks. I think we are going to wrap the show up with our gut reaction, which is us getting our next random noun for next week's episode. So with that, I think, Alison, I will turn it over to you.
All right. So Mark generated last time and I got to have the first reaction.
Sorry. First, I'm taking us off track.
Rewind.
The only thing we didn't do for wrapping up this episode was checking in with our initial gut reaction on this word. So Alison, you were a 7.5. How are you feeling on a scale of 1 to 10?
So as you'll recall, I said 7.5. I wanted to give it higher because it's science and orbit and I was all excited and I thought I better rein it in. I'm actually going to go with like a 10 because, and the reason I'm going that way is because not only all the cool science stuff, which I'm so happy you followed up on, then there's just so much more. I realized that I'm so interested in that was connected to this word. And I had so much fun doing all this research and going down like kind of a more cultural path with it. So I got to say it went from a 7.5 to a 10 for me. And I think you were at a 7 initially.
I was at a 7 and I danced around the idea of going to a 10 as well. It did increase for me. I think I'm going to be a little bit more conservative than you. I'm never conservative, people, ever. But I will be in this instance and go with like a 9, just because I don't know. I don't know what a 10 is going to look like. Is that even going to be possible? Excuse me. But yeah, I think a 9, similar to you, it really came through on my expectations. And for me, it just, like I said, I actually got a little emotional at random points, just being like the nature of this long story that starts from ancient peoples saying the pattern of that shinier object, this planet is different. And that they dig at that. You pull at that thread for thousands of years. Like, that's just amazing to me. So yes, 9.
All right. We're going to have to chart this over time and then be able to look at our statistics.
Oh, I'm all about that. I will start a spreadsheet because I am mad data geek that way.
And I'll buy you the Edward Tufte book so you can understand how to best present that data in a beautiful way. I
have Tableau. I don't have Tableau, but I love Tableau. If anyone from Tableau is listening.
I love that we both got emotional at some point. I got emotional over Voyager and you just got emotional over, I don't even know what. So
something, human curiosity.
Okay, so we're going to take turns every week generating the words, and we'll take turns having first reaction. And Mark was kind enough to give me first reaction next week. So I have the random word generator. As Mark has mentioned, it is just randomwordgenerator.com. So, if you want to play this game with your friends at home, you can do that as well. We just have it set to nouns because we had to limit it in some way. So are you ready, Mark?
Yes. Give us the homework that isn't homework. I don't think of it as homework, but give us our assignment.
The fun work. It is construction.
Construction.
I think you're
sorry, I'm like, that's big. Yeah, my head's already like flooding with ideas and images and so on. Ooh. Ha! I'm wondering, this is going to be fascinating to see. All right. Anyway, right. Our gut reaction. Sorry, before I start going off. Go ahead, Alison. Go ahead.
No, you get the first.
Oh, is it me? Oh, okay. I'm thinking.
I'm going to start playing Jeopardy.
I know. Sorry. While audience is like checking their device. Like, is this thing still on? Tap, tap, tap. I hate using the same number, but it really comes in at a 7 for me again. I'll push myself if I keep coming in at 7. I swear I'm not going to be boring that way. But it is like I'm excited by it, but I'm not sure of some things. So 7.
Okay. I think it's so big. I think that's the first thing you said too, hilariously. It's so big and broad, which I think means there's going to be a lot in there. But I have to say, just my gut, my initial is like, So I'm going to give it a 5. Like, it's just not like piquing any particular excitement in me, even though I recognize there's probably a lot of avenues to go down. So I'm going to go with a 5. So Mark's at a 7 and I'm at a 5. And if you tune in next week, you'll see if we stay at those numbers.
Yeah. We never talked about if we can lock them in. And I swear, audience and Alison, I'm not doing this because you went to 5. I was sitting here thinking, do I want to go lower? Do I want to go 5 like you? I'm going to go to 6. I'm going to lock in a 6 because I'm not sure if my hopes of where this rabbit hole will lead are going to be quite as rich and interesting as I am hoping they go. You know what I mean? I could dig into this and be like,
But I think that's what makes it interesting, because you could come back next week and be like, I said 7, but I mean 2. But all right, we'll let you this time. No,
you're right. Oh my gosh, audience. I am this crazy. I promise. All right, 7. You're right. I said 7. I'm going to stick with 7.
I'm going to let you go with the 6. I'm just never going to let you do it again in the future.
No.
Oh, okay.
I don't want to. No, I think this is good, right? Because this forces us. I'm freakishly about rules. Sorry. Isn't that attractive, everyone? Woo! I'm going to stick with it. No, you're right. I think we should think about it and state it, and that's it. And then we can only change it at the end of next episode. That's it. I'm at 7.
All right. We're 7 and we're 5. Mark, why don't I turn it over to you to wrap us up?
Good. Well, just to send us off, everybody, I want to thank you for tuning in to the ReNouned podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please follow and subscribe. Whatever platform you're on or listening to, you should be able to subscribe and actually follow the show. Also, if your platform gives you the opportunity to rate us, usually with stars and a comment, we would absolutely love it if you gave us a good rating and helped us establish our fledgling podcast at this point. That would be wonderful. Also, please visit us at renownedpodcast.com. There you can do a bunch of things. You can find ways to just listen or watch from there. You can also find a blog where we'll post additional thoughts and content, or you can subscribe to get updates right into your inbox whenever we publish something there, which will largely be related, recaps to the shows, et cetera, et cetera. And that's it. So please tune in next week for our new word construction. And thank you. You are all renowned in my book, dear audience. Ooh, it's so cheesy, but I had to say it. We will see you. We will see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.